Group 3, and today we are looking at managing outsourcing, a look into the inner workings of Philips. Group 3 consists of Felipe, Tarita, Sachin, Veronique, Rita, Anders, Branimir, Nina, and myself, Shupi.
Thank you. So to start with the reasonings, when we went through the study case, we saw that there was a decision to be made by Philips. How to increase, do we want to increase the headcount to achieve the same amount of results, or do we want to outsource? Because at that point, they realized that the headcount that they will have will not cover the level of activities and the speed that needed to meet their business targets. So they needed to increase the efficiency in the organization of the IP activities. They also needed to increase the process to guarantee the quality of the products that they would they will create. And in the end, the reasoning behind this is to increase the productivity by having the same FTE, the same internal resources, and this will also lead to potentially improve the quality as one of the main tasks that they had, and also to improve the access to knowledge, because there's some highly specific knowledge that is not necessarily always within the IP department, and law firms can of course provide these more advanced skills. So the outsourcing was made from a strategic and organizational context. My colleague is going to follow with the next presentation.
Thank you, Felipe. So the second question we will look at is to analyze the reasoning of outsourcing within an institutional economic framework. The first theory we wanted to look at was property rights theory, and this is where there's a bundle of rights that can be assigned to another party, and you can assign all the rights, or you can assign specific rights depending on what exactly you are trying to achieve. In our particular scenario of outsourcing, we have these allocation of rights to either one or more individuals, and it could be private patent law firms and also law firms in general, so not necessarily just IP law firms. And using property rights theory, what we were doing is allocating a right to control the use of the property. So this is in terms of, for example, invention disclosure, and also in terms of contact with the inventor, and we're giving this to the law firm. The law firm then would have the right to manipulate this property, and by doing so, creating quality patents and consistent quality in work. And the law firm also would have the right to appropriate some benefit from the property. And in this scenario of the outsourcing, it's not the traditional sense where you would get royalties, but rather they would appropriate it in terms of legal fees, and they would internalize the external effects in terms of this the use of the property, both positive and negative. And when you assign these rights, depending on how the rights are assigned, that determines how much incentive that person or that body has to deploy and exploit the particular rights. And in terms of our outsourcing relationship, the law firms would be insensitized through to reduce the cost, because of course we were looking to improve efficiency and reduce costs, and they would be insensitized to do this because they of course will be competing with other law firms, other IP firms that can also do the job. So they would want to be as efficient as possible and as cost friendly as possible. I will now pass you on to my colleague who will look at the transaction cost theory.
Thank you, Tarita. So as the name says, here we are comparing the transaction costs. So the cost between insourcing, the option of insourcing, and the option of outsourcing. And the idea is to minimize the transaction costs and obviously increase the profitability. So what is the decision that has to be made, and the comparison which has to be made is to see whether the internal costs are bigger or smaller compared to the external costs. So obviously, on one side, the costs in case the actions, the procedures stay in-house, in case more employees are required, in case everything is done in-house, compared to the cost of outsourcing, of working with another law firm, with an agency, with someone else, of having to negotiate contracts and do those transactions. So that is the decision. Outsourcing requires also budgeting to avoid surprises. So you have to calculate the in-house costs, the outsourced cost, and the expected external spend. So what would be part of that? And of course, within this theory, we have to take into account the influencing factors, which include the frequency of transactions. Once a year, 2 times a year, every month, once in 3 years, however it is negotiated, the business conditions, the uncertainty in general, the strategic relevance, and so on. So here we focus on the costs and the option which is more cost effective for the company. And now we are moving on to the agency theory.
Thank you very much, Nina. So we can progress with explaining what we just were starting with the theory of the agency theory. So what would be the context of reasoning about outsourcing within the agency theory? So then we should be analyzing it from the principal-agent relationship perspective. So there are a couple of points we could keep there, and which we could make. First of all, we could look at it from the cost control point of view. So whether how should be reflected in that part, and so from the budgeting point of view, this is something which could be positively assessed. So the cost, because the cost would be allocated principally, so beforehand, and which they could be known. But there's when we're looking at the agency theory, then mostly we should analyze the context of the relationship and of the cooperation and how are relating together the principal and the agent. So here we have, and in my view, this theory is mostly is quite well adapted to be assessed in this case, because it actually tackles and can help us to tackle one of the main frictions which can exist between the interest which the two parties have here, and that's the outsourcing firm. So in this case, Philips, and the agent, which would be the firms. So they of course should have their interests would need to be aligned. But of course we know that, and also in real life we can relate to this situation where of course the interest of the principal would be, namely, just to say, of quality of work, fixed costs and reduced costs, and speed of work. Whereas the agents and the outsourced work might not meet all that criteria. So we need to, when we should think about this, and how this is assessed, this is something which we could take into account. Also, something which is very helpful, the agency theory is very helpful in assessing the quality checks, which we could actually discuss a bit later in the scope of the other question. But this is something which is also quite important, because it's important to monitor the quality of the performed work, and this is one of the reasons how one can assess whether this was done, and whether with this outsourcing would be feasible from that point of view. Thank you. Moving on.
Thank you, Branimir. So let's look about the question 3. So here Philips decided to put in place two ways to manage outsourcing, the conventional one and the virtual IP console method. So if we look at the conventional outsourcing, in this case, the in-house IP console decides whether the invention is managed inside or outside of the company. In this case, the advantage is that Philips could use existing resources. If we talk about transaction cost here, the costs are lower than in the other method, because the costs are due only to the drafting or the study search on the invention. Then for the second method, the virtual IP counsel, here all the invention are sent to a virtual IP counsel who executes the decision and completes the drafting. So here you have two kinds of cost. So the cost for the outside IP counsel, but also additional costs for the IT to manage the access of the IP management system. One major point here to notice is that the internal Philips resources could be allocated to higher added value tasks. So if we move to the question 4, please. Okay, so here is the role of the IT. In fact, here the IT is a support function, but it has a great value because it allows Philips to operate the IP management process by giving access to the data and manage authorization. So if we look on the left side of the slides, for conventional outsourcing, here the outside IP counsel don't have access to the system, but in the other way to proceed, the virtual IP counsels, they have access to this IP management system on a rule-based authorization, so with a kind of access restricted. As the previous group said, here the major issue for the IT team is to deliver data security, but also data availability for all the participants in this system. So let's move to the next question.
So this slide is a brief summary of how the 3 institutional economic theories relate to this quality checking activity. So in terms of property rights theory, so Philips would engage law firms and patent attorneys to draft patents and take care of their activities like licensing, etc. And so through their advice, these firms could control and manipulate how Philips is able to determine and use its rights. In terms of transaction costs, this could be like a cost burden to Philips because it is a monitoring cost that needs to be accounted for. But it could prove to be an advantage because quality checking can correct defects and Philips can take action, which could be profitable. In terms of agency theory, law firms and patent attorneys could act in a conflicted manner. So you could have firms which are working with Philips's competitors, which could put them in a tricky situation. They could also withhold information about prosecution, etc. So this is a slight risk. So over to Nina.
Okay, so in the framework of quality management and taking into account property rights theory, basically the principle, which is Philips in this case, would assign a level of right to an external law firm. And in quality checking, it's quite useful for them to go through some questions, such as whether they are assigning the correct level of rights and the extent of rights which have been given to various law firms. So for example, if highly trusted law firms can be given or allocated a high concentration of rights, whereas medium trusted law firms can be given limited or control rights, and there would be different levels of reporting required. In juxtaposition, for example, with highly concentrated rights to highly trusted law firms, they are given the autonomy to make decisions with little to no reporting requirements. And in the case of the virtual IP council, they are given access to IP management. And for low-level rights, the firms might have to seek more approval. And so it's a good time for Philips to incorporate these questions into the quality check. Anders?
Yes, and then if we continue on the quality checks and the property rights theory, so what is the firm that we're working with manipulating the property to our desired quality and consistency? This is the million-dollar question that we all in-house and external counsels fight every day, because what is quality of work? So I think this is a dual side question. Yes, we will check and we can check it, but what do you want? So I think that's one of the questions that Philips normally asks them, and you're asked as an outside counsel. And then also the second question on this page that they probably also asking in relation to the property rights theory is, what's the benefit or the appropriation benefit for the outside firm? So what's the positive effect that the outside firm have in working with us in quality and consistency aspects? So these are two of the other questions that you normally gets asked, and I think Philip has definitely in their checklist to check with for quality issues or concerns. Next slide.
Thank you. Beside the quality concerns, we have to look at the transaction costs as well. So here the quality checks would serve at looking again at the cost comparison. So have the circumstances and the costs changed? How about the structural form? Would it be more cost effective to outsource everything, to keep everything in-house, or to do a hybrid form, for instance, having the filing in-house and having the prosecution and maintenance outsourced? So those are all the questions which have to be asked and which we are sure that Philips is also asking themselves when making this decision. And lastly, moving on to the agency theory once again.
Again, coming back to the agency theory, which in our view could be very well versed to analyze the context of the actually risks which are needed to be addressed within addressing and having the role of this quality checks being done from the agency cost theory point of view. From the agency theory point of view, not agency cost. It's been left. So basically, we need to take into account that there are some inherently present risks or divergent interests which might occur between the agent and its principal. So the quality checks would need to be aimed to ensure that they could be aimed they could be reduced as much as possible. So then, of course, we should need to also, another thing which could be problematic is that we need the one aspect of the quality checks is to ensure that the ongoing work which would be outsourced needed to be performed in a manner which would be with a higher consistent level of quality, and this is obtained by having the perpetual, so having the scheduled checks and the quality controls which would ensure that. So further than that, there is the potential risk, or what's the agency theory helps us to understand that there might be some problem in the information flow, which goes both ways, from the agent to the principal and vice versa. So in order to mitigate that there would be no loss of information, which would be relevant to have in that context, we would need to have, we could also do that with a quality check to ensure that certain level of information flow or checkpoints are addressed, are also provided, so that this is something which is not missed as well. And finally, another thing which is one of the cornerstone of outsourcing is, of course, the keeping the costs in check and balance, and so that having the quality checks are also versed well there, because if something is being done in a proper manner and is verifiably done so, then this ensures in long term that the lower costs, which are of course also being present there, that they're kept so. Otherwise, there should be a risk. If this level of quality would not be kept, then the advantage or the benefit of the cost reduction would get lost. So having said that, I can also further return the mic to our colleague who will wrap up the presentation.
So we would like to say thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sue. Hey.